Today, Biographics is going to profile the famous explorer David Livingstone, but how could I start this video without first mentioning my newest YouTube channel called Explored? It has more documentary-style videos than you see on this channel, but I think if you dig this stuff, you'll find the weekly explorations, get it, Explored, fascinating. Whether it's looking at countries where insulting the king is a jailable crime to the use of diplomatic bags to smuggle cocaine, it covers a wide variety of stuff. New videos on that channel once a week. Please check it out through the link below and do consider subscribing. On paper, it can be hard to say exactly why David Livingstone is ranked among the greatest explorers of Africa. Objectively speaking, he wasn't a particularly effective missionary, and most of the areas he traveled to had already been explored by other people. On a personal level, he got into frequent arguments with his colleagues and mostly ignored his wife and children. And yet, his legend endures, even now when the European explorers who paved the way for imperialism are not remembered that fondly. As one of his historians put it, at a time when countries are being renamed and statues are being toppled, Livingstone has not fallen. The cities named after him still exist, as does Blantyre, Malawi's financial center, which was named after Livingstone's birthplace. So what made him stand out? Maybe it was his inspirational rags to riches stories, starting out in a poor family working in a cotton factory and ending with a state funeral at Westminster Abbey. Maybe it was his utmost hatred of slavery, as he made it clear again and again that everything he did in Africa had the ultimate goal of undermining the slave trade. We'll let you decide for yourself if he was truly deserving of his place in history, as we make it our mission to explore the life of David Livingstone. David Livingstone was born on March 19, 1813, in the small Scottish town of Blantyre in South Lanarkshire. He was the second of 7 children to Neil and Agnes Livingstone, and the entire family lived in a one-room apartment at the top of a tenement building. The local cotton mill was the biggest employer in town. Neil Livingstone already worked there as a tailor, and it was expected that his sons would start working there too as soon as they were able, in order to help out the family. John, the eldest, was the first to do so, and he was soon joined by David Livingstone when he was just 10 years old. Both of them worked as piecers, meaning that it was their job to repair broken threads on the spinning jennies. This was long and hard work, even by the standards of the 19th century. The mill opened at 6 a.m. and work continued until 8 p.m. with just 2 40-minute breaks for meals. However, the owners also funded the local church and the school, and David used this to his advantage. Despite the long hours, he still went to school for 2 hours each day, and education and religion both found a place in his heart from an early age. This sometimes placed David at odds with his father, who, as a deeply devout man, feared that his son's growing interest in science would make him stray further away from Christianity. He tried to encourage, even force David to read nothing but theology, but it was no use, as his son became more and more convinced that the two disciplines could be reconciled together. At one point, the family abandoned the Church of Scotland and joined a congregational church, and this introduced David Livingstone to a few people who would have a great influence over his outlook on life. First was the American Presbyterian minister Charles Finney, who was one of the leaders of a religious movement known as the Second Great Awakening in the United States. Finney was a staunch abolitionist who considered slavery a great sin, and also worked with the Underground Railroad to provide runaway slaves with safe passage to Canada. The second was a German Lutheran named Karl Gutzlav, who became one of the first Protestant missionaries to the Far East. After reading a pamphlet of his asking for medical missionaries to travel to China, David thought that he finally knew how to continue his scientific interests in a way that would satisfy his father. He would study medicine and then become a missionary. In 1836, David Livingstone had saved enough money to enroll as a medical student at Anderson's University in Glasgow, known today as the University of Strathclyde. While there, he also studied Latin and took divinity courses by Ralph Wardlaw, a prominent Scottish clergyman and another fervent anti-slaver. In 1838, Livingstone was accepted as a member of the London Missionary Society, or LMS. Before being able to travel on a mission, he first had to do a probationary year of scriptural studies in Essex in order to become a minister. Livingstone wanted to go to China, but the outbreak of the First Opium War in 1839 put an end to that ambition. The LMS suggested that he travel to the West Indies instead, but he soon had other ideas. In 1840, he met Robert Moffat, another LMS missionary who had recently returned from Africa. The two became friends, and Moffat excited the young Livingstone with tales of his missionary work in South Africa. Moreover, Moffat expressed his beliefs that through the spread of Christianity and the establishment of legitimate trade trade networks, they could undermine the slave trade that was rampant on the continent. This convinced David Livingstone. Once he was ordained and became a medical licentiate, he wanted to go to Africa. On December 8, 1840, Livingstone set sail for Africa. His destination was Kuruman, the mission founded by Robert Moffat in the northern part of South Africa. After a slight detour to Rio de Janeiro caused by powerful winds, the new missionary touched ground in Africa in March 1841. He spent a few weeks in Cape Town getting accustomed to his new surroundings. He finally arrived in Kuruman by the end of July. The missionaries mainly interacted with the Bakwena people, established a couple of hundred miles to the north of Kuruman. Livingstone made several trips to meet them, stayed with them for weeks at a time, and within a year he was fluent in their language, called Setswana. A couple of years later, Livingstone founded a new mission at Mabotsa and relocated there. Kuruman was once again in the hands of Robert Moffat, who also brought along his eldest daughter Mary. She and Livingstone became close, and the two married in 1845, going on to have 6 children together. Despite his lofty ambitions, his good intentions, and his long-lasting fame, David Livingstone was not a good missionary, objectively speaking. After all, the main purpose of missionaries is to convert people to Christianity, and the total number of converts attributable to Livingstone is 1. His name was Sechele, and he was the chief of the Bakwena people living in what is today Botswana. He showed a great interest in Livingstone's biblical teachings, but there were 2 obstacles standing in the way of his baptism. First was the fact that Sechele was a rainmaker, a practice deemed too similar to witchcraft by the missionaries. Second, and more importantly, was the fact that, as tribal chief, Sechele had 5 wives, and again this was considered problematic for a Christian. But in the end, Sechele agreed to give up rainmaking and divorce 4 of his wives, and Livingstone baptized him in 1848. The conversion didn't take. It was later revealed that the chief never really broke off contact with his ex-wives when one of them became pregnant. Livingstone had no choice but to denounce him, but even so, Sechele never abandoned his new faith. He kept preaching to others about Christianity for long after Livingstone had left, and one could argue that he was a far more effective missionary than Livingstone himself. As far as the Scotsman was concerned, he was ready to move on deeper into the heart of Africa. He had heard people speak of a lake located in the far interior. He was referring to Lake Ngami, but in order to reach it, he would need to cross the Kalahari Desert. It took Livingstone several tries to accomplish his goal. His first journey in 1849 was relatively easygoing. He picked the right season to cross the Kalahari and had plenty of supplies and men to help him. His party left in May and followed the Batete River until it reached Lake Ngami. Livingstone wanted to cross the lake and make contact with the Kololo people and their chief Sebetwain. However, for this he needed a boat, and he did not have a boat, so his party returned home. A year later, Livingstone made the journey again, this time bringing his family along. However, 2 of his children fell ill, so they had to go back once more. He was ready for a third attempt by 1851, this time bolstered by a 25 guinea prize from the Royal Geographical Society, or RGS, for discovering Lake Ngami. Livingstone risked everyone's life taking a shortcut across the desert, but this time he was successful. The missionary managed to reach Sebetwain shortly before the chief died of pneumonia. So Livingstone's original plan, it went out the window, but now he had another idea. He had heard about a great river, one that led all the way to the eastern coast of Africa. On August 4th, 1851, he arrived at this waterway known as the Zambezi. He then thought back to what Moffat had told him years ago. If they would be able to establish an effective route for the legitimate trade of English goods, this would undermine the slave trade, something which Livingstone still considered his most important goal. But in order to accomplish this, he would need to cross the Zambezi. This is when David Livingstone's career as an explorer started in earnest. He sent his family back to Britain as the journeys would be too dangerous for them. He secured the aid of Sekeletu, Sebetwain's son and successor, who was eager to establish a trade route to Luanda in modern-day Angola. In November 1853, Livingstone and his party began their voyage up the Zambezi River and into Angola. It proved to be a difficult trek. Once the rainy season had started, the expedition could no longer travel by canoe and had to ride oxen. Party members were stricken by malaria, Livingstone included, as were many of their pack animals. The explorer became completely reliant for communication on interpreters provided by Sekeletu, as he left the region where people spoke Setswana, and that was the only African language he understood. Everything was more expensive than anticipated, and the expedition had used up most of its trade goods way sooner than they had planned. Despite all these obstacles, a tired and sickly Livingstone reached Luanda on May 31st, 1854. He was in such bad shape that a British commissioner in the city tried to send him back to England, but the explorer refused. He thought that a water route down the Zambezi to the east coast might be more accessible, so that is what he wanted to try next. After a period of convalescence and a return trip to Botswana, Livingstone was ready to set off again. He departed in November 1855, again assisted by Sekeletu, who provided his expedition with men and resources. During his travels, it is believed that David Livingstone became the first European to set sights on a giant waterfall, which the locals called Mosi au Tunya, meaning the waters that thunder. Livingstone renamed it Victoria Falls in honor of Queen Victoria, although both names are officially recognized today. This voyage went considerably smoother than the one to the west. On March 2, 1856, the expedition reached the Portuguese settlement of Teat, where most of the party members stopped. The only ones who continued on were Livingstone and his chief guide and interpreter, Sekwebu, whom the explorer described in his diary as his right-hand man. Livingstone had promised to take Sekwebu to Britain, and that was their next destination. The duo continued canoeing down the Zambezi until May, when they reached the seaport of Quelimane, today in Mozambique. Thus, David Livingstone might have become the first European to cross southern Africa from west to east, although, to put this in perspective, many African and Arab traders had already done this journey. In July, the pair left for England, but tragedy struck on the way. While traversing some rough seas, Sekwebu fell overboard and drowned. Livingstone himself had arrived in Quelimane in poor health, stricken by fever, so he first stopped on the island of Mauritius to recuperate before setting off for the long journey home. He arrived in Southampton on December 12, 1856, and quickly discovered, to his surprise, that he had become a minor celebrity. Unbeknownst to him, the RGS had published the letters that Livingstone had written to him, presenting his voyages, and had already awarded him their gold medal. He was given a reception by the Royal Geographical Society, followed closely by another one from the London Missionary Society. Livingstone's fame grew the following year when he wrote a more detailed account of his travels and published it under the name Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. The title might not have been too pithy, but the book became one of the best-selling travel journals of its time and led to multiple speaking engagements for Livingstone. By the end of the year, the explorer had become a national hero. In 1858, he was named a Fellow of the Royal Society and obtained an audience with Queen Victoria. He was given the task of leading a second Zambezi expedition, although this one had the full backing of the British government. Livingstone was given a large grant, a team of scientists, and even a steamship to travel on the river. The goal was just what the Scotsman was hoping for: to investigate the feasibility of British commerce on the Zambezi, which would have a crippling effect on the slave trade. So, in March 1858, David Livingstone set off once more for Africa. This trip did not go as well as the first one, exposing Livingstone's limitations as a leader in charge of a large scientific expedition. More dangerously, though, the Scotsman wrote in his diary about his belief that his mission was under divine providence, convinced that everything he did was guided by a higher power. Therefore, he refused to admit to any mistakes and did not tolerate criticism from his companions, which led to a very strained working environment. Indeed, many of the other members of the expedition either abandoned Livingstone or died before the journey's end. The team physician, Sir John Kirk, put it plainly when he wrote, "I can come to no other conclusion that Dr. Livingstone is out of his mind and a most unsafe leader." But let's start at the beginning. The second Zambezi expedition left England on March 10, 1858, aboard the steamship Pearl. It was carrying a smaller steam launch christened the Ma Roberts, which was how the African locals referred to Mary Livingstone. She was also on board, by the way, but she stayed behind in Kuruman as she was pregnant once more. Once they reached the Zambezi, the first thing they did was realize that the Pearl was too big to use on the river, so they had to rely entirely on the launch. This was also when the first man abandoned the mission after having a falling out with Livingstone. It was Norman Bedingfield, the steamship captain. This, however, was still only a minor inconvenience. The true setback came when the expedition reached the Cabra-Bassa Rapids. Everyone else saw them and concluded that they could not be navigated, but Livingstone refused to admit this and simply said that they needed a more powerful boat. He would have been aware of the rapids from his first trip, if not for the detour he made to Teat, which caused him to inadvertently skip over them. Despite his dismissal of the turbulent waters as only a minor obstacle, Livingstone began looking for an alternative route, which he believed he found on the Shah River. Again, he encountered rapids, and again he concluded they could be easily traversed in a proper steamship. The team carried on the Shah River until they reached Lake Nyassa in September of 1859. By this point, two more men had abandoned Livingstone: Richard Thornton, the geologist, and Thomas Baines, the expedition artist. Originally, the mission was only supposed to last 2 years. There were only a handful more months left until the end, but Livingstone wasn't done, as he wanted to try another water route into the African interior on the Rovuma River. So now he had nothing to do but wait and see if the British government would extend his mission and, more importantly, replace the battered and broken Ma Robert with a new ship. The team engineer, George Ray, also left and went back to England in March of 1860 when the original mission had finished. Livingstone's request was begrudgingly approved, and a new steamer, named the Lady Nyassa, was built and shipped to Africa. This took a long time, though, and it wasn't until January 1862 that the explorer received his new vessel. The ship came in parts, though, and it took another 4 months to put it together. His wife came along on the second ship that brought the steamer, but their reunion was short-lived. Mary Livingstone fell ill with malaria, and she died on April 27, 1862. David Livingstone was stricken with grief, but was determined to press on regardless. The Lady Nyassa was ready to go in June, but by then the river was too low to allow for safe travel. He still wanted to continue, though, and decided to use sailing ships to traverse the shallow waters. This was what prompted Kirk to write that Livingstone had lost his mind, and indeed, this idea was dangerous enough that it finally caused Livingstone to admit to a mistake and convinced him to turn around. The year 1863 wasn't much more productive, as many crew members were sidelined with malaria or dysentery. A letter from London officially put an end to the expedition, and Livingstone began making preparations to return home. He took the Lady Nyassa to Zanzibar, and from there he travelled across the ocean to Bombay, where he sold it and made arrangements to go to England. This return was nowhere near as celebrated as his first. The government had spent around £30,000 on the expedition, funding it for over 6 years, even though less than a year and a half of that time consisted of actual river exploration. Overall, the results were considered below expectations, and the mission was deemed a failure. Despite the poor reception to his last trip, David Livingstone wanted to return to Africa for a third time. However, now he found it much more difficult to secure funding. In order to garner interest for the expedition, Livingstone sought to answer one of the most burning scientific questions of the day: what was the source of the Nile? In 1862, fellow explorer John Hanning Speke discovered that Lake Victoria was the source of the White Nile, one of the 2 major tributaries of the Nile, but it was hardly a settled matter. Other scholars, Livingstone included, believed that there was another source closer to the Zambezi. After a few years, he managed to secure another grant, although this one was a more modest £2,000. £500 from the government, £500 from the Royal Geographical Society, and £1,000 more from private sponsors. His official title was roving consul, a position that came with no salary and no pension. David Livingstone set off for Africa once more in January 1866, not knowing back then that he would never return. He was the only European on this trip. He recruited all his helpers in India and Africa. His intention was to travel first to Lake Bangweulu and then to Lake Tanganyika to see if there were any links between them. Because of limited funds, the rainy seasons, tropical illnesses, and local wars, progress was extremely slow. As the years passed, his supplies dwindled, and Livingstone noticed that they were getting smaller with each new shipment. The year 1871 was particularly traumatic. By then, Livingstone was in poor health and out of supplies, and he had to turn for help to the men that he despised most, the Arab Swahili slave traders. What was more shocking was that he started to like them. They nursed him back to health and sent him cooked food every day and listened while he taught them about the Bible. All of this is new information, by the way, discovered only a few years ago thanks to spectral imaging. In his officially published journal, Livingstone omitted some of the more unfavorable parts of his journey. These entries come from his personal diary, which for almost 150 years was considered illegible. That's because Livingstone had run out of paper and ink and instead used berry juice to write on an 1869 copy of the Standard newspaper. The juice had almost completely faded away, but thanks to spectral imaging, the writing became visible once more. Anyway, back to the doctor, because he was reminded in a very brutal way that just because the slavers were nice to him, a white British scientist did not in fact make them nice people. On July 15, 1871, he was witness to the Nyangwe massacre, when slavers attacked and killed around 400 Manyema people, most of them women who were attending the local market. Livingstone described the event as the most terrible scene he ever saw, and expressed a great shame for associating with these men. From then on, he retreated to a town called Ujiji, and his diary ended soon after. Meanwhile, the Western world was unsure of what had happened to David Livingstone. His last communication with them occurred in 1869. Some thought he had died, but others were convinced that he was still somewhere out there in a remote part of Africa. This gave an idea to American media magnate James Gordon Bennett Jr., owner of the New York Herald. He wanted his paper to run a campaign to find Dr. Livingstone. For this purpose, he hired Welsh explorer Sir Henry Morton Stanley, who travelled to Africa in search of his Scottish counterpart. It took 2 years, but in November of 1871, Stanley entered Ujiji carrying an American flag and greeted the former missionary with the famous phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" Stanley's arrival brought some renewed determination to Livingstone, who was ready to resume his explorations despite being in poor health. The Welshman tried to persuade him to return to England, but this proved to be in vain, so instead the duo explored the northern end of Lake Tanganyika together and found no connection to the Nile. Afterwards, Stanley returned to America and published a book about his journey entitled How I Found Livingstone. Meanwhile, the Scotsman set a new mission for himself, which was to explore the Lualaba River in search of a link to the Nile. This, however, proved to be impossible given his physical state. Livingstone was suffering from fever, bleeding, and terrible back pain, and by early 1873, he could not walk on his own anymore. David Livingstone died on May 1st, 1873, aged 60. We don't know if these were his last wishes, but two of his most trusted companions, Chuma and Susi, took out his heart and buried it under a tree near the spot where he died, where the Livingstone Memorial is located today. The rest of his body was embalmed and shipped to Britain. Back home, David Livingstone received a stately funeral at Westminster Abbey. He was, once again, a beloved national hero, thanks partly to the New York Herald's campaign and Stanley's book, but also due to his death in the line of duty. He perfectly matched up with the ideal image of a Victorian explorer, and has remained popular throughout the centuries, despite his many failings, and even to this day, he is hailed as among history's greatest Britons. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to check out that new channel I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Explored. I am linking to it below. And thank you for watching.